Thank you. Okay, Trina, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trina Soulos, and I'm joining you from the Eora Nation. Dr. Susan Watt and I will be presenting on research that monitors host community attitudes toward refugee settlement in Armadale, New South Wales. Our research asks about the acceptance of refugees at a community level. And as far as we've been able to garner, the research on host community sentiment is unique in Australia and even on a global level. The New South Wales city of Armadale is Australia's newest regional refugee settlement location under the Humanitarian Settlement Program. And for those not too familiar with Armadale, the city is around 500 k's north of Sydney. It's an inland university and agricultural town, home to around 25,000 people. The Yazidi are a persecuted minority from northern Iraq and Syria. And since Feb 2018, the Armadale community has received around 650 Yazidi refugees. In the settlement sector, we often assume that we know how a host community perceives and experiences newcomer populations. And very rarely do we have an empirical measure which takes the pulse of the views of the broader host community over time. So for SSI, partnering with the University of New England offered a golden opportunity to monitor the spectrum of community attitudes and then use those emerging findings to tailor our community engagement approach. I'll talk some more around how SSI did this later in the presentation, but now I hand over to Dr. Susan Watt from the University of New England to talk us through the main findings of her research.
Thanks very much, Trina. We conducted 5 telephone surveys during the first 3 years of refugee resettlement, each of which interviewed a new random selection of 200 Armadale community members. This gave us a representative sample each time. We also re-interviewed a subsample of people from the earlier surveys at the end of 2019 and again 2020. This allowed us to test whether individuals' attitudes were changing. The idea was to understand Armadale attitudes to refugees, identify areas of concern, and provide timely information if problems in community relations arose. We conducted the surveys in April and September 2018, February and October 2019, and November 2020. As you can see from the timeline, the response rates were very high in all surveys, and this is great because it makes our sample very representative. I'm going to first present some results that are computed across the community as a whole. I'll then turn to the audience segmentation, in which we attempted to identify clusters of like-minded individuals, followed by some longitudinal results. And overall, what I'm going to tell you is basically a good news story. So the Armadale attitudes started out positive and became more so. The level of concern about the impact of refugees coming to Armadale reduced. The amount of contact with refugees increased, and contact has been generally experienced as positive. Residents see more benefits than disadvantages in the refugees coming to Armadale. So I'm going to start with the cross-sectional results for the sample as a whole. We rated people's overall attitude to the refugees coming to Armadale on a 0 to 100 scale. So you can see from this graph here that it increased significantly across the surveys. There was a change from 69 in survey 1 to 76 in surveys 4 and 5, and that's a 7% increase on the 100-point scale. We also asked people about their level of concern about the impact of refugees coming to Armadale on a 1 to 5 scale. Concern decreased significantly across the surveys. The change from 2.78 in survey 1 to 2.01 in survey 5 represents a 15.4% decrease on the 5-point scale. Participants were also asked to give the reason for their rating. This is about their level of concern. We received a similar number of comments in each survey, and what I'm showing you here is a table that presents the reasons in order of which were most frequently expressed. As you can see, concerns about jobs has been most pressing, but the number of comments about this decreased significantly in surveys 4 and 5. Comments about resources decreased, and comments about integration increased. But the red highlighting here is showing that these are positive comments. So many of the integration comments were positive. There was a concern that the refugees would not integrate though, which has stayed quite steady across the surveys. At the same time, comments about contact, which tended to be positive, increased over time. So we did ask participants how much contact they've had with the Yazidi refugees. We asked this from surveys 2 onwards. this was recoded to a 0 to 4 scale where 0 equals none. So as you can see, level of contact has steadily increased, and this is despite the pandemic. The rating in survey 4 of 1.45, so this is an average, would mean somewhere between a little bit of contact and some contact. In surveys 4 and 5, we asked people where the contact took place. The contact is increasingly occurring out and about. So this is in parks, in shops, in the street, and it's also occurring in work, business, and places of education such as TAFE. We asked people how the contact has been. This was coded to a -2 to +2 scale, where 0 is neutral. So you can see this in surveys 2 onwards. So from survey 2, the contact has generally been experienced as positive. That means it's above 0, with an average of 0.84 in survey 2, which increased in survey 3 and has stayed reasonably steady since then. We asked people about their attributions for how positive or negative the contact was. So while attributions could be many things, for example, to how friendly the respondent is, how open they are, etc., most of the comments were based on what the Yazidis are like. So this is this ochre-coloured column called About Them. The comments about the Yazidis were overwhelmingly positive. So in my spreadsheet with codes that I extracted from people's comments, I have 47 positive codes for About Them and only 13 negative ones. Where have I gone? Sorry, I've gone in the wrong direction here. Positive, benefits and disadvantages. So we also asked people if they have personally experienced any benefits of refugees settling in Armadale. So this is their personal experiences. And we asked the same for disadvantages. So I've given the frequency here of the benefits and disadvantages. And you can see that the benefits have greatly outweighed the disadvantages in both surveys 4 and survey 5. So a community isn't just a mean and a standard deviation. There tend to be bubbles of people with similar opinions. We divided the respondents into groups of like-minded people using a technique called cluster analysis. The clusters were formed on an agglomeration of the same 6 variables in each survey. Surveys 1 and 2 revealed 4 groups that we labelled resistant, concerned, positive and enthusiastic, with the positive groups forming the majority, even at baseline in survey 1, where they were 66% of participants. You can see we've got a similar solution in survey 2, but both the concerned and positive groups expanded in survey 2. But in surveys 3 and 4, we got a different solution, where basically the resistant and concerned groups contracted and basically sort of combined into one group. So we just called it resistant/concerned. But a really, really positive group emerged in survey 3 that was, it was more enthusiastic than the enthusiastic group. So we called them champions. As you can see in survey 4, the champions group greatly expanded. This surprised me a lot, but you know, it shows this very, very positive response we're seeing in the Armadale community. However, in survey 5, and this is our pandemic year last year, the first of the 2 pandemic years, it returns to the original solution with resistant and concerned groups separated out again, and the champions became merged in with the enthusiastic group. But as you can see, the positive and enthusiastic group make the vast majority. In surveys 3, 4 and 5, consistently the resistant and concerned people make up about 20% of the respondents. We also re-interviewed participants from earlier surveys to see if the results of the cross-sectional surveys would also be reflected in changes in individuals' attitudes. I divided the sample into 2 groups according to whether they were initially in one of the positive or negative clusters, and then ran the analyses. The results for attitudes and level of concern showed significant improvements for attitudes among the negative group, but not among the positive group. So the negative groups became more positive and the positive groups remained positive. The results for contact showed increasing contact for both positive and negative groups, and a small trend towards increasing contact valence for the positive group, but not the negative group. So basically the results of the longitudinal analysis corroborate the results of the cross-sectional surveys and demonstrate that individual attitudes were changing. Finally, people tend to think that Armadale is unique, highly educated, multicultural, sophisticated, So would the Armadale experience be repeated elsewhere, or is it just because it's Armadale? So we incorporated into the survey quite a few items from the mapping social cohesion surveys that are conducted Australia-wide annually. We compared Armadale with other areas coded interregional, which is our geographic coding. Generally speaking, Armadale was very similar to the rest of interregional Australia, with only a couple of significant differences. And from this, we draw the conclusion that Armadale is not as different as one might expect. So moving along quickly, I'm going to turn back to Trina now for the rest of the presentation. So over to you, Trina.
Thank you, Sue.
And I'll just take this point and just say you've got a minute and a half to go, okay?
For sure. As practitioners, the research has helped SSI stay in tune with community views and ensure that our practice is both relevant and responsive to emerging community issues. Like in Armadale over the years, there have been bushfires, drought, and of course the pandemic. As such, we've been able to tailor our engagement approach against the concerns identified by the research. Turning firstly to work, we learnt from the baseline data that one of the more prominent concerns was around job security. Some were concerned that refugees coming to town would take their jobs. Looking further into the data and the cluster analyses, we understood some of the conditions triggering this concern was around the livelihoods of families. And in respect of this, we messaged on the economic benefits that the refugee settlement program had brought Armadale and how steady population growth contributes to regional infrastructure. Over time, it's been great to note that concerns around local job security has significantly reduced in Survey 5. Regarding resources, we learnt some were concerned about the capacity of local services to assist refugees. Now, we knew this concern related not only to SSI, but that broader service landscape and was a collective responsibility to address. So we shared this concern among the network of services essential to refugee settlement, health, education, other social and human services. And since the baseline, there have been quarterly forums among such service providers. Again, as with job security, the research showed concern about service capacity, but significantly reduced by Survey 5. In regards to the concern around the Yazidi refugees' integration into Armadale's socio-cultural fabric, although as settlement practitioners, we could see this was happening organically, the research indicated we needed to share these stories of community participation more broadly. Over the span of the survey's frequency of this concern, it's gone up and down.
Sorry to interrupt, Trina. Would you mind just wrapping up or going to your concluding slide, please? We've just reached the 12-minute mark.
Sure. Sue, do you want to jump? Thank you, Sue. Okay, so in looking at the indicators that the regional settlement approach in Armadale is beneficial for both newcomer and host communities. Within the newcomer community, we see high rates of retention in Armadale. Secondly, we're seeing participation in local community life, which is evidenced by data in the research about contact locations. Turning to the host community, the UNE research demonstrates that the host community has reported increased positive contact with refugees over time, that the community values the diversity Yazidi bring to Armadale. There are perceived positive benefits for local businesses and the economy. And importantly, the research indicators that members of the Armadale community are indeed enjoying their new friendships and enjoying interactions with the Yazidi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing piece of research. I actually spent 2 amazing years in Armadale at UNE and know what an amazing place it is. And while it might be comparable, I also know it's very unique and a lovely place to live. So it's really great to see this positive research come out, particularly connecting to some of the early findings and sessions from earlier in the day. We'll save questions for Sue and her team for later, but now I'd like to hand over to Debbie Carstens from the Northern Settlement Services Limited, who will be presenting along with her colleagues Dor Arche from Settlement Services International, Jane O'Dwyer from Manning Valley Neighbourhood Services, and Laura Sardo from Nepean Multicultural Access. I'll hand over to you, Debbie. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? And secondly,
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Can see your screen, but if you want to go to full presentation, yes, that's working brilliantly.
Beautiful. Okay, so my name is Debbie Carstens. I'm Manager of Settlement and Communities at Northern Settlement Services, and I'm privileged to be presenting on behalf of the New South Wales Settlement Partnership with my colleagues from the partnership available to respond to questions at the end of the workshop. So the New South Wales Settlement Partnership, for people who've not aware of it, commenced in 2015. It's an innovative model of settlement services delivery with a consortium of 21 community-based and ethno-specific partners. So that's led by Settlement Services International, SSI, with the other 20 partners as delivery partners in both metropolitan areas as well as in regional areas. And we're all funded through the Settlement Engagement Transition Support Program, SETS, from the Department of Home Affairs. And we all have to be very careful when we talk about being SETS workers. So there are 5 regional partners in the NSP regional partnership. There's Connecting Community Services, which is based in Dubbo and covers the Far West and Orana region. Illawarra Multicultural Services, based in Wollongong, that covers the Illawarra, Wingecarribee and Nowra. Manning Valley Neighbourhood Services, covering the Mid-North Coast, based in Taree. The Nepean Multicultural Access, that covers Penrith, Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury region, and Northern Settlement Services, that I'm from, which covers Newcastle, the Hunter, the New England and Central Coast. There is a strong history of funded regional settlement work in our partnership. For example, there's been 40 years of experience by NSS, Northern Settlement Services, in Newcastle and the Hunter, and then subsequently in the wider locations that we now cover. There's 25 years of experience of regional settlement work in the Manning Valley Neighbourhood Services, and 32 years for Nepean Multicultural Access, and so on and so on. We've been doing regional settlement work for a long time. The idea for the Insights into Regional Settlement in Practice paper that we're going to launch later this year started with a politician's request to SSI for a briefing about the New South Wales Settlement Partnership's work in regional settlement. This was in the midst of a growing conversation about regional refugee and migrant settlement and a body of academic and consultant work that was being documented. We wanted to write something as regional settlement practitioners that reflected what day-to-day settlement work looks like in regional areas. We continue to be keen to share our experience as part of this wider conversation about regional settlement and to reflect on recommendations for going forward. The perplexing reality is that while writing this paper together, our resources and time were stretched, as settlement funding to deliver our regional settlement work in this same period has been cut by some 30%. First in January 2019 and further again from the 1st of July 2021, which is of course affecting our service delivery in an already under-resourced area. So to talk a little bit about the regional settlement context, the context of the regional settlement service delivery work that we're doing. Many of the communities that we work with are not regional refugee settlement locations where the government is actually organising settlement of people, but there are a range of ways that people are attracted to the areas that we work in. So there might be local employment, educational opportunities, the regional environment's attractive. I loved the notion that we were talking about earlier of a place of peace and comfort that was that people were looking for. And for many people in regional areas, they've moved to the region because it's a pathway to a permanent visa in Australia. Amongst the regions that our NSP partnership covers, there are 2 locations that are regional refugee settlement locations, and they're in Newcastle and Armadale, both part of the Northern Settlement Services service delivery region. Another part of the context that we work with in regional settlement service delivery is that we're working with a wide diversity of ethnic backgrounds. There might be small numbers from quite a wide range of cultural groups in each of our regions. We're also challenged in our work with the distances that we're involved in covering. I mentioned earlier some of the different regions that people are covering, and you can hear the kind of the wide the wide expanse of geography that covers, although perhaps some Sydney-based people may not realise how far it is to travel between some of those locations. And also limited public transport in many of the places that we work. So where that's meaning that we're then going and doing a lot of outreach work to get to people rather than them being able to travel to us. Also in our regional settlement context, we're working in a smaller service system, even in terms of government and community services. It's not as extensive as you would find in a large urban area or in the metropolitan area. We also find that with other service providers, there's a limited skills and knowledge in terms of being culturally responsive, and mainly due to the limited contact that many service providers actually have with multicultural communities. And so all of these things are part of the context in which we work as settlement providers. Some of the keys to successful regional settlement practice, or the way that we go about working, are things like collaboration and partnership. In Newcastle, we've got a weekly multicultural youth group that's run, and there's 6 or 8 organisations involved in the partnership that pull that off and deliver that every week. Innovation is really important as we work with limited resources to be able to deliver to a wide range of people. There's community development activity, and engagement of the wider community is really important, and that wider welcoming community. We have loads of interaction with and support from local volunteer community groups, and many of these community groups are largely from mainstream community rather than multicultural community, mainly because of the absence of significant multicultural community groups. Many of the activities that we run are run as multicultural rather than ethno-specific activities that you might, in the way that things might be done in metropolitan areas. And also, we don't tend to have a large number of community organisations from the multicultural sector. So we don't have elected community leaders. If there are community organisations, those organisations might be quite fragile. So we tend to talk about active community members from different communities rather than having any formal community leaders amongst the multicultural communities that we work with. In many of the regions that we work as settlement workers, we're also the only multicultural service provider in our region. There is an expectation from the others in the sector around us that others in the community around us, that we will be providing services to the whole of the multicultural community. And that might be schools contacting us about kids that they're concerned about. It might be neighbourhood centres checking in with us. There's a whole range of different people in the community that would be expecting that we're responding, but unfortunately our settlement, the settlement sets funding actually has a limited range of people that we're supposed to work with on certain visas and certain lengths of time in Australia and so on. The reality is that we're needing to be responsive to the whole community. We may in fact be the only multicultural service provider in some of the regions in which we work. Another aspect of the work that sort of is part of how we see things happening is that clients often are referred on to mainstream services, but they end up bouncing back to us because of the difficulty with the cultural responsiveness of other service providers and needing to build that capacity. So we get involved in building the capacity of mainstream service providers as part of the work that we do. So things like how to use an interpreter, communicating with people with limited English, what people on different visas are eligible for and so on, are all part of the education process we're doing with the wider service sector. We're going to give a couple of examples of the how we're putting this into practice in different regions in which we're working. So first of all, to give you an example of the Manning Valley. So there's more than 100 different countries represented in the Manning Valley region, and people are mainly on family and skilled visas, with only 9.4% of the population born overseas. I'll let you read those stats yourself there. But we wanted to talk about what community belonging and social cohesion looks like in in the Manning Valley. We note that there's traditionally, Taree is a fairly conservative area with a fairly long history of, unfortunately, racism against the Indigenous community and also a high population. So community belonging and social cohesion in a regional area has a number of different considerations. Because of the limited public transport or non-existent public transport and the vast geography, getting people together includes supporting people to be able to get a driver's license, or supporting them with transport to be able to be participating in something. Support networks from family and cultural groups may be limited or non-existent. And while the community might be diverse, there might be only very small numbers from any one individual group. So facilitating community engagement activities is important to provide opportunities for new arrivals to build new connections and to break down cultural barriers and misconceptions in the community. To quote Jane O'Dwyer from the Manning Valley Neighbourhood Services, in facilitating activities that truly promote community belonging and social cohesion, it's important to be inclusive of everyone, migrant, Indigenous and mainstream. We don't live in boxes, we live together in a community.
Debbie, could I just let you know you've got 1 minute remaining, so you might want to get to your concluding slide just so we can get your key takeouts findings.
My goodness, I have really blown the time. So
that time always flies.
This is a great example of work that was done in Taree with Indigenous women, multicultural women and women from mainstream backgrounds sharing at a Women's Day event. So I'm jumping through a whole lot of collaborative work and other employment-related activity that we have been doing across the partnership, and come to the recommendations that we have put together in terms of our reflection on our settlement work. And that is that a tailored regional model of sets or settlement engagements and transition support service delivery is really important, recognising the different approaches required that for our different contexts, the various different regional contexts, but as opposed to how set service delivery happens in metropolitan areas. There's also different funding models needed in that different regional context for settlement service delivery. The real importance of building community, building collaboration and partnerships as part of what we're doing in our work, the wider eligibility for settlement support in regional areas where we may be the only multicultural service provider available. Professional development training and support for lone and remote workers is really important, and we really appreciate the support that we get through the New South Wales Settlement Partnership, but there's so much more that we would love to have in terms of support and training for our regional service providers, and recognising the value and role of regional settlement workers is important to us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Debbie. And I do realise how very short that time is for all our presenters. So thank you for doing that. Just a quick reminder that if you're not presenting, to put your speaker on mute so that we're not distracted by background noises inadvertently being communicated. I'm homeschooling 2 kids, so there's always inadvertent background noises. So can I now hand over to Debbie? I'll get you to stop sharing your screen and hand over to our next paper presenters, Devaki Monani, Branka Krivokapic Skoko and Jock Collins, who are they with us? I hope they are. They might not be. Oh, there we are. Who are presenting on their longitudinal research.
Okay, great. Hi everyone. My name's Devaki, and I've really enjoyed all the presentations since this morning. Our project title is Refugees Improving Agricultural Productivity, Key Findings from Mount Gambier and Naracoorte. Basically, the funding was sourced by Professor Jock Collins and Branka. And in those days, I was sort of appointed as the person who was doing all the field work across the country, from up north Mount Gambier to, up north Cairns to down south Mount Gambier. Sorry, I'm now residing in the north, so I'm trying to get my bearings right. So the project time frame was from 2012 to 2015, and we're sort of now sharing all our findings and attempting to write as many journal articles as possible. Particularly now we're back in that discourse around refugee settlement. Sorry, my second slide was around recognition of traditional owners and Indigenous cultures. CDU acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting and pays respect to Larrakia elders, both past and present, and extends that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just move on to slide 3. And so the funding body, which I actually kind of feel really bad that it's sort of now decimated across these years, was Rural Industries Research Development Corporation, and now you've got AgriFuture Australia, so they've pretty much replaced it. And they funded a larger project, which was New Immigrants Improving. So not just refugees. I'm just going to be talking about the refugee data we collected as part of the project. And it was looking at, you know, a number of things. In those days, there was a bilateral free trade agreement between Australia and China, Korea and Japan, and there were new market opportunities for Australian agriculture. And immigrants were part of that conversation. And so these were some of the completed reports: New Immigrants Improving Productivity in Australian Agriculture. We published that material even in Farm Policy in 2017, which is a critical journal. And here are some of the other sort of data dissemination. Details of the study: fieldwork was conducted in 5 Australian states: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia. And there were a lot of interested parties, but I don't know if you remember, in those days there was an exciting and interesting network of people, which were the regional officers, and they were funded by the government, and each state had a regional officer. And the regional officer, the regional liaison officer, actually enabled a lot of my field work. And they said, well, you got to go here, and there's like 100 people settled there. In addition to, in places like South Australia, we had the migrant resource centres that enabled the data collection. A number of people were interviewed. So you've got permanent immigrants, immigrant farmers, temporary immigrants, including working holiday makers, Pacific Island seasonal workers, and of course, the humanitarian cohort that I'd be sharing today. I've been hearing a lot about partnerships and productivity, so it's really good that this sort of seems really well into that larger, broader conversation. We're looking at, when we're thinking about agriculture, we're looking at the production context, and we're looking at training, environmental regulations, starting small business. And I know there'll be, Dina will be talking about Ignite after my presentation, which will be great. So the production context is really important to understand when we're looking at productivity and when we're looking at engaging refugees or just immigrants into the context of employment and be part of that producers network. So we need to think carefully about education, training, incubator farms in the context of agriculture. We also need to look at produce and cultivation of own food and local food movements. And I was looking at Sarah's presentation this morning in the Canadian context, and she was talking about belonging to the land, but also through some of these sort of, you know, farming as a mechanism. Again, formal qualifications and sharing of knowledge. One of the things that we found is not all of the humanitarian entrants had formal qualifications in farming. So that's a real, that's a gap, but that's also an area that we can build on for future partnerships, is to see how we can engage humanitarians entrance into agricultural production. I don't know if you're following the news, but across the country, and especially here at CDU, there were like thousands of dollars now spent to establish centers of agriculture studies. And so if we can sort of connect with those to build some partnerships to engage refugees from here on, that could be an idea to tap into, so that we can actually have trained humanitarian entrants in the agricultural sector, as opposed to ad hoc and those you know, mechanisms by which, and I'll talk in a minute about corporate partnerships. So obviously Sarah touched upon this morning around sense of belonging and social relationships and inclusion. I wanted to move quickly on to corporate partnerships. So Woolworths, for example, in my next slide, you'll see in this third slide, and I'll go back to that one. The role of Woolworths in corporate partnerships. We are Karen Burmese. This is what the participants shared. Our hands are tiny, and because we have tiny hands, Woolworths prefers us to be the contractors as herb growers. Our English is not very good. However, we've been lucky to receive these contracts. So going back to that critical notion of corporate partnerships, and in the case of we've seen even in Lavadak, which I'm not talking about Lavadak in today's presentation, but we all know it's overly researched. I've actually traveled to Nil and Lavadak. Again, they were happy to form that partnership and establish training for those people who were settled there. So it's really critical to have these corporate partnerships and these corporate partners who are going to recognize the strengths of a particular community and harness and nurture those strengths for successful settlement, but also for successful employment. So just very quickly, other sites, in addition to Naracoorte and Mount Gambier, we conducted focus groups, both in Naracoorte, Mount Gambier, and Cairns. We did interviews, but there was one particular, because there was this man in Cairns with $5. He'd arrived in Australia, and now he owned a 50-acre banana plantation. But again, he sort of self-trained himself. There was no mechanism by which people were there to educate or train. He sort of did all the learning based on his previous sort of knowledge in his homeland at the Thai-Burma border. And Nil, I've already talked about Lavadak, and we conducted focus groups. Mamre Farms, which is in New South Wales, you've got a lot of African refugees there, and they were able to grow the organic and sort of ethnic food, and we undertook interviews and observation there. Just very quickly, Mount Gambier, as some of you might know, they between 2007 and 2016, there were 370 Karen refugees settled there and 219 Congolese. And overall, the population has 26,000 residents. It would have changed now post-COVID, but this is the data from when we were collecting data there. As you all know, it is located about 440 kilometers southeast of Adelaide and just 17 kilometers from Victoria. So I've already shared that with you. Naracoorte, as you know, is a really tiny town, and there's around 5,960 residents. However, 170 to 200 were Afghan descent, people from Afghan descent residing in Naracoorte, both Hazara and Pashtun tribes. And so one of the things there in terms of the partnerships that they've had in Naracoorte, they've relied mainly on the Rotary Club members. And I did all of my data collection there when the Rotary Club members had organized a barbecue, and they'd invited 200 people, like they were there. And so you could just go and talk to them. And they had strong connections with the vineyard owners, and they were able to get employment through those connections for the Afghan Pashtuns, in terms of contractors. However, this is just an added information. The Hazara focus group people said, well, sometimes the Pashtuns don't hire us. But the Pashtuns were clever because they'd got the mechanisms around becoming the contractors. They had the contracting agencies. So again, when we're thinking about ethnicity, it'll be good to sort of carefully have a look around, you know, who are the competing sort of ethnicities, and whether there can be some conflict. In the case of Naracoorte, there were no conflicts. However, the Hazara felt that they were a bit marginalized because the original contractors or the contracts were given to Pashtuns. I mean, this is beyond the scope of the discussion of this presentation, but it is something to think about when we're thinking in this, moving on between this period of 2018 to 2022. What we really need to study now is what has occurred in terms of partnerships, and how have those partnerships, particularly in the agri sector, become or are evidence, can build the evidence base around success. And this really needs to occur at federal level, because I've been doing lit searches, but finding not much has been done around the agriculture sector. And there's great potential, particularly now with the funding of the new centres across in different universities. So our report, there's the references.
Dina, sorry, I'll just interrupt. There's a minute to go.
Yeah. And so I'm pretty much done now. I really wanted to sort of bring all the narratives together and shed positive light on, initially when we drafted the abstract, I was thinking about, in the media, we have the discourse around, you know, how they're dependent on their dole bludgers or whatever it is, a negative narrative. But what we found in our research is there are actually productive people across the country, and they are in agriculture, and we managed to showcase that through this research. So really, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Devaki, and apologies. I think I called you Dina beforehand, so my apologies. I'm already jumping ahead to the next paper.
No, that's okay.
No, that is so interesting and really very powerful about the role of corporate partnerships in really successfully establishing those employment opportunities and successful regional resettlement. So thank you very much. So our last paper is from, and I'll stop, I'll get my timers on track, is being presented by Dina Petrakis from Settlement Services International. And I think Jacqui is also assisting you. Yes, okay. So same deal. I will let you know when you've got about a minute to go. Okay.
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience. This is obviously the last presentation, and we can all have a break after this. I'd like to acknowledge the lands that we're meeting on today. I'm on Gadigal land, which is part of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and hope for a future with peace and reconciliation at its heart. Jacqui Gilligan, my colleague at SSI, and I are going to present some early narratives from the Ignite Small Business Startups program, which we established in Armadale and in Coffs Harbour in the middle of COVID in 2020, and discuss some of the early learnings from those areas. And there was a lot of resonance from this morning's presentations and this afternoon's as well. So thank you, Jacqui. Next slide. I really do need to start to talk about this presentation and discuss a meeting that our CEO, Violet Remiliotis, had with Dr. Ernesto Saroli in 2012, because this was the start of Ignite. And it's important because when Dr. Saroli came to talk at State Parliament in New South Wales, Violet was in the audience, and what she heard him say, the values that he espoused, the principles that he espoused, the humanistic psychology underpinning of the way he conducted enterprise facilitation really resonated with her. And she thought, this is the model we need to use to help newly arrived refugees start businesses. And those values and those principles underpin our program. They include the fact that we concentrate on the person, not the business. We provide tailored, individualized support for all our entrepreneurs. We work with settlement and health issues and any other issues that impact on business establishment. We know that culture can often present a variety of challenges for those new to Australia in terms of their business startup. We understand that language doesn't necessarily have to be a barrier to business establishment. We work with passionate entrepreneurs, and the most contentious thing we do, and people sometimes don't understand it, is we don't motivate, we don't initiate, and we don't judge. And the outcome of our program is a registered trading business, a legal entity that is trading. That's how we define our startup. Thanks, Jacqui. So the next slide will show how Ignite has grown from 2012, when Violet met Ernesto, to 2021.
Sorry, Dina, are my slides not moving? Yeah, here we go. Sorry.
Thank you. So just a few key things. So we started in 2013 with Ignite. In 2017, we got some money to provide our Ignite program to people with disability, and that's expanded, and the tailored model that we provide is doing really, really well. In 2019, I went to Canada and established Ignite in Vancouver, funded by the Department of Immigration, the Canadian government, and there was a lot of learnings there. And in 2020, we expanded to the regions new in Armadale and Coffs Harbour, and Jacqui will talk a little bit more about that. Why does it work? So we triage. It's really, really important that we work with passionate entrepreneurs, because what we find is people have entrepreneurial seizures. They think they'd like to start a business, borrow money, and then because they haven't done any planning or understanding, it doesn't work very well. So we provide a few workshops to give people a taste of what it would like to run a business in Australia. If they're committed, we link them to a facilitator. Thanks, Jacqui. The next one. We provide an ecosystem of support, so we understand our entrepreneurs don't know and can't do everything in their business. So we have collected a resource team and developed it over 8 years of experts that provide pro bono advice and support. We also focus on post-startup services for those entrepreneurs that find it difficult to sustain their business. Through our Ignite Hub, this year and last year we had our COVID response as well, because a lot of our entrepreneurs came back seeking help. And we utilize SSI's corporate services shamelessly to support our entrepreneurs. Thanks, Jacqui. So when we went to Canada, we found that, we thought if we can do it in Canada, we can do it pretty much anywhere, because look at the weather. We had to go through snow. It was a different set of criteria. The businesses were different. We set up our first marijuana dispensary on Vancouver Island. The cohort was different. They also provided it to carers. So we thought with all of those challenges and with such a different environment, if Ignite could work in Canada, and Professor Jock Collins evaluated the program, we could do it definitely in regional New South Wales. And just before I hand over to my colleague, Jacqui Gilligan, I'd just like to say that one of the things that was really, really important was that, sorry, that's my alarm going off to make sure that I'm not over time. Enterprise facilitation and business creation is not just about refugees getting employment, it's about them creating employment opportunities. And as Professor Collins found out when he did the evaluation, in just 2 years and in the time of COVID, with 27 startups in Vancouver, they were already generating jobs within their community. Having said that, I'll hand over to Jacqui.
Thanks, Dina. So I'm going to run through some of our measures, and I'm going to give you some examples of the broad mix of entrepreneurs that we've been working with in the regions and the kind of support that we've been offering. This is a Coffs Harbour infographic. I just wanted to note that we've only been in the region since November 2020, so that's less than a year, and obviously all under COVID restrictions and just generally difficult economic times for small businesses. So in Coffs Harbour, we've supported 63 entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs during that period. And of that cohort, 10 have started their businesses, and we're still working actively with 10. You can see the visa mix in Coffs Harbour cohort is about 80% refugee, humanitarian and bridging visas, and about 20% come from the border Coffs Harbour community. So in the regional areas, we're working across community and offering our services to everyone, all of all types of businesses. Of that 20%, the mix is both Indigenous, it's disability, and there's mainstream entrepreneurs in there as well. The top industries of our clients in Coffs Harbour have been farming, food, cleaning, disability services, and hair and beauty. And I'm going to give you some quick examples if my slides move. So here we have some of our lovely entrepreneurs. It makes Dina and I smile because we know these people, obviously. So we've got Sabiha of Sabiha's Kitchen, and she came from Iraq in 2017. Sabiha is actually non-verbal, so her first language was actually Auslan, which is Australia's deaf signing language. She's got a business which offers traditional Iraqi in-home cooking lessons and a cultural food experience. And we've been helping her with all aspects of her business, really, from her branding to testing her product, compliance, marketing, bookings, and actually helping her like practically during her pilot sessions in homes. Here's Nung Wei. She's from Myanmar. She came in 2015 and she has a permanent hair straightening service with complementary hair products, and we've been helping her with her compliance and her branding and to set up an online store to sell those products, especially during COVID. Here's Zozan and Kamaran, who come from, they've got Everest Syrian Foods. And those in Coffs Harbour will know that they operate out of the markets there. And we've helped them to really look at their costing and pricing models, because although they've been operating for a while, they were really struggling to show any kind of income to be able to expand their business. And the fourth one here is close to our heart. This is the Myanmar Community Agricultural Co-op, which is a really unique and beautiful enterprise. And it really rests on the strength of SSI's community engagement and whole of community and partnership approach, because the idea for this not-for-profit farming co-op, which is run by Myanmar locals, was sparked through a community engagement consultation session with the local Myanmar community, where the overwhelming desire of that group was to actually gain access to land and be able to return to the farming roots from their home country, and to do that in a community-centric way. So what came out of conversations with the community has now blossomed into a fully registered operating community co-op. They've got access to land, and they're currently raising funds to get their first crop in the ground. I was going to show you this little video, but
yeah, Jacqui, I'm really sorry. You've got only a minute to go, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm going to pop that in the chat instead. And my slides, okay, here we are. Here's Armadale. So in Armadale, we had a very different experience, because both the resettled community and the economic conditions there are obviously quite different. Obviously, entrepreneurship tends to be the path of those that are really willing to take risks. And we were informed when we first came to Armadale by our colleagues there that the Yazidi population that are resettled in that area were really quite recently arrived. And I think Trina and Sue mentioned that, you know, that's one of the most, the newest resettlement zones. So as Dina said, we don't motivate our entrepreneurs, and only those with capacity are going to come and work with us on their passion. So in Armadale, we've worked with 19 entrepreneurs, 10 have started businesses, but you'll see from the visa mix that the majority of those are actually citizens and permanent residents. In Armadale, we've worked with the Mini Barn, which is a restaurant inside the popular motel in Armadale. It's run by an Australian local, but it's employing and training Yazidi cooks. And the goal is to grow the restaurant into a training program where connections and English language and employment can all thrive. We've actually found in Armadale that it's the First Nations population that have actually jumped into the program. And we've seen really strong success with the model, with that cohort. One of the female elders in Armadale has been the core of that success, and plus our close connection into the Armadale Aboriginal Cultural Centre and keeping place. But our intent in Armadale in Year 2 is to really keep engaging broadly across the community and connecting supporters and partners, and keep offering our small business startup information sessions so we can encourage those interactions and connections with fellow entrepreneurs and the community members, and to keep growing our resource team and supporters. And we know over time, when they're ready, the Yazidi community will come and join our program. I just wanted to really quickly call out how important everyone has said that collaboration and partnerships in small communities is really key. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but many of those supporters that are really engaging with us in the regions. A call out to Lendlease, who's actually provided funding to support the Coffs Harbour Ignite program, and many others that have been supporting our new engagement in the area.
Thank you so much, Jacqui and Dina. I can see some really strong common themes across these papers. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen, and I'll also ask Debbie, our awesome inadvertent IT person, to stop recording as well, if that's possible.